On today's mailbag, we're going to stack up Notre Dame's playoff resume compared to other top teams. Plus, we're going to look ahead to next year's season opener and the future of the Miami rivalry. And in the spirit of Halloween, I'm going to reveal who I believe are the biggest Notre Dame villains of my lifetime. That's next.
You are Locked On Irish, your daily podcast on the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, and welcome into Locked On Irish, your daily Notre Dame podcast. I'm your host, Tyler Wojciak. I'm a Notre Dame alum and producer at Fox Sports, and I hope you had a great Halloween, and I appreciate you joining me here on Friday, November 1st to kick off your Friday and a new month by making this your first listen of the day. We are free and available wherever you get podcasts, and you can watch every episode on YouTube. Please like and subscribe if you are watching along on YouTube, and remember to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast if that is how you're tuning in today. And this episode is presented by FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets. If you win your first $5 bet, just visit FanDuel.com to get started. All right. Fridays mean mailbags, and we have another great one in store for you today. Got a lot of great questions. Thanks as always to everyone who submitted theirs. We're going to cover a lot of ground today. We're going to talk the playoff. We're going to talk about next year's season opener against Miami and whether or not Notre Dame should continue playing Miami every single year. And then at the end, I get called out for one of my takes, and I'll explain it a little bit further. Plus, I'm going to go over some places that you don't really want to find yourself on the Notre Dame campus. But let's begin here with a question from @A_Castellucci05, who asks, how do you see the committee handling Notre Dame's ranking compared to Texas A&M? Next Tuesday, same night as the election, pretty hilarious timing if you think about it, is going to be the college football playoff rankings debut of the 2024 season. And it is a little bit weird that Notre Dame is going to be coming off a bye. I don't know if that's going to drastically impact how the committee views them. Let's be honest, I don't know if this committee is diving through tape every single week, so recency bias definitely does play a factor, whether or not they want to admit it. But that being said, I do think that Notre Dame is still going to be at least one spot ahead of Texas A&M. And the reason I feel that way is because in the past, the College Football Playoff Committee has valued head-to-head. Just look at last year. They had Texas over Alabama. Throughout last year when they had the same ranking, they both had one loss. Then ultimately in the College Football Playoff, Texas was ranked ahead of Alabama. They did put Michigan above Michigan State back in 2021. That was after Michigan State had beaten Michigan that season. But then the Spartans ended up losing to unranked Purdue, and that's when the switch happened. And then they ended up getting throttled by Ohio State a couple weeks later. So it didn't really matter in the end. But with the expanded playoff, I think that they're going to play it safe and keep Notre Dame ahead of Texas A&M, and I think that is the right thing to do, even though I understand that Texas A&M is a hot team, especially coming off a big win at home against LSU. They also just dominated Missouri when they were a top 10 team, although now that Missouri has gotten smoked by Alabama, I don't think that people in the national media, people in the College Football Playoff Committee really look at that win the same. So Notre Dame is a really interesting resume. We've talked about this a lot this week. They have one of the best wins in college football this year, going on the road and beating Texas A&M in the season opener. But they also have by far the worst loss of any team that is competing for the College Football Playoff. And then outside of that, their schedule has been really weak. It's not their fault that Florida State has been one of the worst teams in college football this year, but what was already expected to be a pretty favorable schedule ended up being even easier than we thought it would. So Notre Dame has to win out, and they're going to hold on to that win. And even though there's a chance that the committee could rank Texas A&M over Notre Dame, I still think that Notre Dame fans should be rooting for Texas A&M to win every single game, because that win is so important to Notre Dame's entire resume, so they need that to look as good as possible. But that being said, I think in the first rankings, Notre Dame will be one spot at least ahead of Texas A&M. Next question, we're going to stick to the playoff here. Vito Periello, what do you think the percent chance Notre Dame will host a playoff game is outside of Notre Dame winning out? What needs to happen for them to host? Well, according to the ESPN playoff predictor, it's about 54%, which I also find odd because the week prior when Notre Dame was beating Georgia Tech and they just shoved that playoff ranking or that playoff predictor down our throat, it was 63% with the win. So I don't know how they just lost 9%, but I think that shows you that that algorithm, whatever model they're using, doesn't really work that well. And it's been talked about before. I mentioned it on the show. They also have the FPI, their football power index, I think is what it is. I worked at ESPN for 2.5 years. Nobody knew what it meant. Nobody even knew why they used it, right? I don't know who is getting the call from above that's like, hey, when we talk playoff teams, you got to use the FPI. It's like, okay, we'll use it, but what does it mean? I know Matt Fortuna talked about this as well. He used to work at ESPN, so he gets it. Honestly, I think my best guess here would be it's about a 50% chance, because if Notre Dame wins out, I think they're going to host a playoff game. And if they don't win out, they're not going to get in the playoff at all. So it's kind of one or the other at this point. And Joel Klatt did a segment on his show this week. I help out with that at Fox. And we basically went through some different scenarios. And then when we finished there, we came out with Notre Dame being the 8th seed, hosting a first-round matchup against Tennessee. Think about how much fun that would be. I'd also love to get down to Tennessee one more time. I've talked about it many times before, how much fun I had visiting Tennessee and going to a college football game in Neyland Stadium. But hey, I would much rather Notre Dame host a playoff game than have to travel down to Knoxville for that one. So that could be an awesome matchup. I think that Tennessee is a really good team, although they're not the team that we might have expected them to be at the start of the season when Nico was kind of dealing. Nico Iamaleava, their quarterback, and they're putting up like 50 points plus on NC State. They're actually a team that's driven with their defense and running game, and not the quarterback that they paid $8 million to get out of high school. So I think Notre Dame actually matches up pretty well with Tennessee. That would be an awesome game. So as long as they go 11-1, and I say if because I don't want to pencil them in, and I know some people like get mad at me about talking about Notre Dame making the playoff. It's like, I'm not playing, right? And I get told to focus on Florida State, or like, why are we even talking about a playoff? Earlier on in the season, I got that. Like after the loss to Northern Illinois, I was like, it is way too early to be even considering it. But now that they've gotten to this point in the second bye week where they're 7-1 and right there in the mix, and then you have to consider the fact the playoff rankings literally come out this week, I'm going to talk about it, because if I did 2 straight weeks of Florida State prep, I think a lot of you would get sick of it. I know I would, right? Because Florida State is terrible. So yeah, obviously the Notre Dame players and the coaching staff, they shouldn't really be thinking playoffs. But guess what? I'm not on the team. And what I say has no bearing on what is going to happen on the field. So I'm just going to talk about different scenarios that are going to play out or that could play out, because that is more entertaining. And that's what I'm here to do. I'm here to entertain. I'm not here to play for the team. So the team should be focused on that. I'm going to talk about what is interesting. And right now, Notre Dame's chances at hosting a playoff game are interesting to me. All right, next question. Todd Ziegert, does this team remind you a bit of last year's Michigan squad? Obviously, Michigan didn't stumble like Notre Dame versus NIU, but the stats are very similar. Then Tom goes through a bunch of numbers. I'll save you some time here because he really did his research, so shout out to Tom for doing this. But basically, he's like, their passing yards per game is similar to Notre Dame. Both defenses are only giving up 157, 156 pass yards per game. The rushing yards are pretty similar. Notre Dame is actually averaging a little bit more yards on the ground per game than Michigan did last year. Turnovers are similar. Riley Leonard has a similar amount of touchdowns as J.J. McCarthy did at this point. And then Tom goes on to say, I'm not predicting a national championship, but it's kind of eerie how similar they are. The biggest difference statistically is yards attempt. And yeah, that's great, Tom, or that's great, Todd. Excuse me. I appreciate you taking the time to do that and put in the effort here. But you're missing a key piece. Their offensive line was much better than what Notre Dame has right now. They were much more experienced. They had won the Joe Moore Award back-to-back years, and they honestly probably should have won it a third year in a row, but instead they gave that award to Washington, maybe because it was like voter fatigue, kind of like with the NBA MVP, and they gave it to someone else. And then Washington played Michigan in the national championship, and then everyone realized, wow, Michigan actually does have the superior offensive line. So yeah, statistically, there are certainly some numbers at this that are similar. And at this point last year, Michigan had not really played a good team yet. They ended up controlling Penn State in the early part of November, and then they beat Ohio State again at the end of the season. But I think that the biggest difference when you look at these two teams is the experience factor, especially on the line of scrimmage. And then also look at what Michigan had in the defensive line. Like, they were absolutely loaded. And I think that Notre Dame is a really, really good defense this year, but Michigan's defensive line last year was crazy. They had Jalen Harrell, they had Josiah Stewart, Derek Moore, Braden McGregor, Kenneth Grant, Mozzie Smith. Like, they were so stacked. They had so much depth. And Notre Dame's depth is really being tested without Jordan Botelho and Boubacar Traore. Maybe at full health, I would say that Notre Dame's defense could kind of match what Michigan was doing last year, but I still think they had the biggest advantage on the line of scrimmage, and that's what carried them to a national championship. Also, J.J. McCarthy was in his third year in that system. He was a little bit more consistent as a passer. I never thought that J.J. McCarthy should have been a first-round pick or anything like that, but he's a better college quarterback than Riley Leonard is right now, even though Riley Leonard is more of a threat on the run. And also, last year's Michigan team was basically the third phase of that whole process, right? Like, they got embarrassed in the college football playoff the first time they made it when they faced off against Georgia. Georgia dominated them. And then Michigan got embarrassed again when they lost to TCU in the first round. And as much as I loved watching TCU win that game, I think we can all admit that was probably a bit of a fluke. If they had played 10 games, Michigan probably wins at least 6. But hey, on that day, TCU was better. So hats off to the Horned Frogs. But then in the third time Michigan made the college football playoff, they were ready. They had the scars. They were experienced, and they were ready to go. They knew what it took to win, and then they ended up winning a national championship. So even though there are some stats that might suggest they are similar, I still think that Michigan's team last year was far better than what Notre Dame has this season. All right, coming up next, should the Catholics versus Convicts rivalry with Miami become an annual occasion? Today's episode is brought to you by 5 Hour Energy. Our friends over at 5 Hour Energy know that being a passionate football fan isn't just a hobby, it's a way of life. It takes a lot of energy to power through all-day tailgates, touchdown celebrations, or an agonizing second overtime, which is why they've created the Stand the Fan 5 Hour Energy Shot with a special flavor called Fan Fuel, the energy shot made just for super fans like us. The fans who are first in the parking lot and who are the last to leave, we see you. And you know who else gave me a bit of Notre Dame fan fuel this past week? The moment when Jeremiah Love broke off that 64-yard run to the house that basically iced the game against Navy, even though it was only the first half. 5 Hour Energy knows that no matter what team you root for, being a fan requires heart, soul, and a whole lot of energy. Whether you're prepping for the big tailgate or ironing your jersey, your game day to-do list is always a mile long. That's why the limited edition Stand the Fan 5 Hour Energy Shot is here to help keep you fueled throughout the season. What's your fan fuel this week? Whatever it is, do it with the 5 Hour Energy. Available on 5hourenergy.com, shipped nationwide. All right, our next question comes from Irish Bronco 2010. Thoughts on the Miami news? Should Notre Dame play Miami every year? So if you have not heard by now, Notre Dame will open next year's season on the road at Miami. Labor Day weekend. They have not announced the exact date. We just know that it's going to be on Labor Day weekend. My guess is that it probably will be that Sunday night. Maybe they'll push it all the way back to Monday. I don't know. That remains to be seen. But I'm guessing it's going to be the only game on that day. Usually that's what they've done in the past on ESPN, where there's like a big slate of games on Saturday, one big game on Sunday, and then another one on Monday. So not sure when that game will be played, but my thoughts on it. I mean, I talked about this with Matt Fortuna yesterday. I don't love it. I have no problem playing Miami. I have no problem really playing at Miami. I think it's a fun rivalry, but it does not really benefit Notre Dame at all to open the season there. And for the record, Notre Dame did not want to open the season there either. Tim O'Malley from Irish Illustrated made that clear in some of his reporting. Notre Dame didn't want to open the season there. It's partially because they have a game against Texas A&M just 2 weeks after that. There is one more spot to be filled on that schedule, I believe, in between those games. So you're going to have Miami in the season opener. Then you're going to have one more game that they still need to fill, and then Texas A&M at home after that. And then a couple weeks after the Texas A&M game, they have to go on the road to Arkansas with a home game at Purdue in between. And look, the Razorbacks aren't a powerhouse SEC team or anything like that, but they are really good at home. Just ask the Tennessee Volunteers about that, who went to Arkansas and lost this season, and I can assure you that those Arkansas fans are going to be geared up and ready to go to host Notre Dame next year. So those are three very tough opponents, including two on the road before the calendar even turns to October. And no matter what happens with Notre Dame, they are almost certainly going to have a first-year starter at quarterback, whether that be Steve Angeli, Kenny Minchey, or CJ Carr. Even though they've been around, they won't be freshmen. It will be their first season as the starting quarterback, and that's going to be their first month as the starter. Who knows how the rest of the roster is going to shake out, but I will be shocked if Notre Dame comes out of September undefeated. That is just a really daunting schedule, and when you consider Notre Dame's independent status in this college football playoff era with 12 teams, like Notre Dame can really only afford one loss and still feel like a lock to get in. The moment they lose that second game, they're not necessarily eliminated, but it's totally up in the air because they don't have a chance of playing a conference championship game, and they are at the mercy of the results of so many other teams. Considering this is the first year, we don't really know how the college football playoff is going to look at two-loss teams, and I guess the benefit for Notre Dame next year is that we think their schedule will be a lot tougher, so if they do finish 10-2, odds are they're going to have some good wins along the way. But I just really don't like front loading it as much as they are in this case. Like, I like playing tough games. I like the fact that Notre Dame's schedule next year is going to be a hell of a lot more exciting than it is this season. But having all of those tough games at the beginning of the year just doesn't really make sense when you have a first-year starting quarterback. And the thing that kind of bothers me is that Notre Dame is supposed to be independent, and a big reason why they choose to stay independent is so that they can have more control over their schedule. And it feels like they have less control over their schedule than ever before. They have their 5 mandatory games against ACC opponents every single year and they rotate. And I believe that the TV executives had a big say in why that one ACC game against Miami is going to be played in the season opener. Plus, Miami on Labor Day weekend, it's going to be 1,000,000 degrees. And I already talked yesterday about how the environment at Miami, like, I wasn't even at that game, but I still hear about it. Luke Smith's been there. He can tell you all about it. I'm sure we're going to talk about it on the show here either next week or in the coming weeks, or certainly before next season. And I know a lot of other people who were at that game. It was my senior year of college. A lot of people made the trip, and it was just an awful experience for Notre Dame fans. And if you want to call me like I'm part of the wine and cheese crowd and all that stuff, okay, fine. This kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, where like fans will criticize me as if like I'm playing and I shouldn't be focused on that next year, or like I'm afraid to play Miami. No, I'm not. I'm just not going to go to that game most likely because I just don't think it's an ideal environment for Notre Dame to start the season. And as I said, you've got the game against Texas A&M. Like, there is a chance that Notre Dame could be like 3-2 going into October, and that's not really a great place to be, even if they could end up being a good team next year. And if your only counter to that is, so what, just win? Like, okay, guess what? Teams lose in college football. Good teams lose in college football when you have a schedule that tough. And if you lose twice, then all of a sudden the entire season might be up to the vote of a playoff committee, even if you have a good roster and you get better as the year goes on, because you lost early on in the season when you really weren't ready to play. And Notre Dame already had a tough game against Texas A&M to start off the year, and Arkansas a couple weeks after that. So going on the road, playing Miami to start, I just don't love it. And yeah, I just find it funny that people think like I'm scared of playing Miami, as if I'm going to suit up in that game. No, I'm just looking at the big picture here. I would much rather have Notre Dame played Miami in like November like they did in 2017. They could still go down to Hard Rock and get revenge. Instead, they're going to have to do it at the beginning of the season. Maybe they get it done. We'll have to see. We're going to be talking about it a lot over the offseason. That's another thing why I'm not like super stoked about it, because I talked so much about the Texas A&M game, but I was really excited for that one. Not going to be nearly as excited for this Miami one, but we're going to see how it shakes out. Next one. This comes from Voluntary Joel 41. I love this question. Now that we know Notre Dame versus Miami will be the first game next year, who is your Mount Rushmore of opposing team villains from your lifetime? And then Voluntary Joel 41 gives his 4 villains. 1, the official who called the Phantom Clip versus Colorado in the Orange Bowl. 2, Matt Leinart. 3, Desmond Howard. And 4, Jimmy Johnson. That's a good list. None of those guys are going to make it on my list. Matt Leinart certainly had a case when I was younger, when I was like, 8 during the Bush Push. I literally cried after they scored. I hated him. I remember like thinking it was so funny that he took ballroom dancing as a class in college, because that was like a big deal at the time. If you don't really remember, I think they did like a feature on College Game Day or something, and fans made fun of him about it all the time. Then I realized later that he was just like a 5th year in college, or maybe he was a senior and just didn't really feel like taking any like legitimate classes. So he took ballroom dancing so that he could basically be a professional football player during his senior year. Honestly, I get it. And I don't want to name drop here, but I actually work with Matt at least once a week on this project at Fox. He's an incredibly nice dude, great person to work with, and unfortunately I cannot hate him anymore. I did tell him to his face that he made me cry, and we had a little bit of a fun back and forth the first time we met, but he's not going to make the list. So here's my 4. Another USC quarterback, Caleb Williams, and then another USC player, Reggie Bush, Pittsburgh head coach Pat Narduzzi, and then former Pitt quarterback turned tight end Phil Jurkovec. Caleb absolutely embarrassed Notre Dame in 2022. He had the FND on his nails. I was at that game with Luke, and Caleb just ran all over that Notre Dame defense. And it's really the only time that an Al Golden-led defense at Notre Dame has been embarrassed. So I hated that. I hated his attitude and the way he approached that whole thing. But you got to give him credit. He was amazing in that game and that season. But then Notre Dame got revenge in 2023. Despite a disappointing season last year, at least they did have that moment. That was so fun. And it brings me great joy knowing that the worst game in Caleb Williams' college career was in South Bend against Notre Dame. Notre Dame never got revenge on Reggie Bush, though. He just absolutely killed Notre Dame. They could not stop him. looking back, the fact that Notre Dame let the grass grow to try to slow down Reggie Bush, and then he just dominated Notre Dame anyways, a little bit embarrassing in retrospect, but he was just so good. And those teams are so dominant. Like, there was a point in time when I was a kid where I wasn't sure if Notre Dame would ever be able to beat USC. And it's a big reason why is because they had guys like Reggie Bush. So he's definitely on there. Pat Narduzzi is on there because he hates Notre Dame and he makes that known. So there's like almost like a respect there. Like, he hates Notre Dame so much and he's so public about it. It's like, all right, at least he doesn't try to hide or shy away from it unless he's doing an anonymous quote in an athletic article that is so clearly Pat Narduzzi. So I guess he doesn't always get out in front of it, but the fact that he hates Notre Dame as much as he does, and Notre Dame faces off against him so many times, like, he's got to be on there. And then Phil Dracovic, who was once considered the savior at Notre Dame. He was going to be the next great quarterback, but then he couldn't beat out Ian Book. Then he transferred, and then he blamed everything on Notre Dame, and then he transferred again from Boston College to Pitt, and then he ended up finishing his career as a backup tight end for Pat Narduzzi. I also hated the discourse around Ian Book and Phil Dracovic too, because people were like, put in Phil, like anytime Ian lost. And I was like, well, maybe he's just not as good. And nobody could come to terms with that fact. And then he goes to Boston College, has a decent start to that season, and then squares off against Notre Dame. Ian Book gets the better of him. And something to look for, if you were to ever go back and watch that game, watch the way that the Notre Dame defense talks trash to Phil. They let him have it. Specifically, Kyle Hamilton and Kurt Heinisch. They are chirping him on literally every single play. And it makes me think that Notre Dame defense, the other guys in that team, they didn't really like him. And then the following year, or 2 years later, I think it was, when Phil was the quarterback at Boston College was terrible, and he was hurt, so he couldn't even play in the game. It was senior day in Notre Dame Stadium. It was that snow game. Phil Dracovic goes on Instagram, writes this long, lengthy post, and then basically accuses Notre Dame of cultural appropriation. It was so embarrassing. It was such a bad look for him, and I think even the last few remaining Phil Dracovic supporters who were also Notre Dame fans, that was when they kind of were like, all right, I'm done with Phil. Then he goes to Pitt. His career doesn't even come anywhere close to what Ian Book did at Notre Dame. So I'm glad that Ian Book proved that he was better, and that Phil, for all the smack talk he had about Notre Dame and for all the finger pointing that he did, maybe it was his fault. Maybe. I've done this rant before. Probably didn't have to do it again, but whatever. It's a Friday. It's a mailbag. That was the question, and he is on my Mount Rushmore of Notre Dame villains. All right, coming up in segment 3, we're going to break down Riley Leonard's development and his chances at a Heisman, plus I get called out for one of my takes. Stay tuned. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. All right, so full disclosure, I do not know if the Thursday Night Football bet that I gave out all week actually won, because I'm taping this as the game is going on. So I'm going to give you a new pick. Browns plus 1.5 against the Chargers. I gave out Browns plus 9 last week against the Ravens. They won outright. I'm all in on the Jameis Winston era. I think the Browns not only cover, I think they actually win outright at home against the Chargers, but we're going to play it safe. We're going to take the Browns 1.5 in this one. That's FanDuel.com, and never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, we just have a few more questions here before we wrap things up. This next one comes from Connor Cross 17. If Riley Leonard had played like he is now from the start, would he have been in Heisman talks? Absolutely. I actually think that if Notre Dame had just won that game against Northern Illinois, if that field goal doesn't get in, Riley Leonard is probably in the Heisman discussion, even though I don't think he should be. It's just the fact that he is the Notre Dame quarterback, and if Notre Dame had beaten NIU, they'd be undefeated, ranked in the top 5, so his name would be thrown around in there, even though I think anyone with eyes and anyone who's being realistic knows that Riley Leonard has not been one of the best players in college football this season. That is just kind of the way the award works in a lot of ways, but this Heisman race is so interesting and unusual because right now, the favorite to win it is a group of 5 running back in Ashton Jeanty, and I'm not criticizing it at all. Like, I think he definitely should be 1 or 2 behind Travis Hunter. Say what you will about Colorado, man. They have had a really good season after that loss to Nebraska, and Travis Hunter is a big reason why. I think it's so different for Travis Hunter compared to other two-way players in the past, because he is literally out there for every single snap on offense and defense. And even though Colorado isn't going to win a national championship or anything like that, they could make the playoff, and I feel like Travis Hunter should be rewarded, because I feel like if every single team in college football was given the option to add one player to the team, most teams would draft Travis Hunter first, and they probably play him both ways. So what he brings to the table for Colorado, he would be my pick right now, even though Ashton Genty is the odds-on Heisman favorite. So if Notre Dame were undefeated and Riley Leonard had been playing like this all season long, then yeah, he'd probably have a much better case. He's been throwing the ball a lot better. We talked about that a lot on this show, how since the bye week, he's been really effective throwing the ball. He continues to be really effective as a runner as well. So he's putting up numbers, especially on the ground. I mean, he has over 500 rushing yards, 11 rushing touchdowns. Numbers through the air aren't quite as good, but they would have been if he had been playing like he has been from the start. So yeah, I wish that Notre Dame had a player in the Heisman race. I actually got to ask the question a couple weeks ago, like, which player on the Notre Dame roster do you think has a chance? I said Jeremiah Love. It's not going to be this year, but maybe next year, though. We'll see what happens. All right. Next one. Justin Zumbrun says, you keep calling that 62-yard field goal. This is the game winner attempt against Northern Illinois. The dumbest decision you have ever seen. I wonder what you would prefer they do in that situation. We all know how horrendous the passing game was. If NIU sent a blitz and a Hail Mary, the line was not going to be able to hold up. Who knows if Riley Leonard could even get the ball to the end zone. At that point, it's either try the stupid lateral play that never works for anyone or try the long field goal with a pretty good wind at your back. I don't think it was a high percentage play, but given the rest of the game, it felt like the highest percentage. Okay, here's where we disagree, Justin. Notre Dame had the ball on the NIU 44-yard line. Maybe Riley Leonard could not have thrown the ball 44 yards in that position because he was hurt. That's possible. I am certain that Steve Angeli could throw it that far. I am certain that Kenny Minchie could throw that far. And you could maybe even bring in CJ Carr, true freshman. You know what? Go out there, throw it as far as you can. Any one of those guys could throw the ball that far into the end zone. And I don't know what it is, but it feels like more teams are converting on Hail Marys than ever before. I mean, the Washington Commanders literally just beat the Chicago Bears on a Hail Mary this past week, and that was a much longer one. Jane Daniels threw it short, and then it tipped right up into a Washington receiver's hands for a touchdown. I mean, Virginia Tech got robbed earlier in the year when they converted on a Hail Mary against Miami. The officials ended up overruling it, but looking back, I think that was the wrong call. Either way, he actually caught it in the end zone, and if the refs didn't screw that up, that's a touchdown. And I'm not going to pretend like a Hail Mary was a high percentage play, but it's higher than zero. And there was a 0% chance that Mitch Jeter was going to make that field goal. His career long is 53. And when he made that 53-yard field goal, it just got over the crossbar. There was not a strong enough wind against NIU to carry that ball an extra 10 yards. So you're going to ask Mitch Jeter, who already had a field goal blocked that game, who then has to kick it low, right, to get a little bit more distance on it. You're going to ask him to kick a ball 9 yards further than his career long, a 53, to win a game. 0% chance that ball was ever going to go in the field goal. So, yeah, this wasn't a great situation for Notre Dame to be in. Honestly, they had 2 incomplete passes right before that field goal attempt because Riley Leonard could not throw in that point. So I think what Notre Dame should have done is brought in Angeli or brought in Minchie. I actually think that Minchie's probably the best option because I think he has the strongest arm in the room. If they bring him in, he throws it to the end zone. Maybe Bo Collins comes down with it or Mitchell Evans, who knows. But I felt like they at least had a chance of scoring on that play. When Mitch Jeter came out to kick it, I literally laughed because there was just no way that was going in. All right, last question. Ricardo Caliente. In honor of Notre Dame's season opener at Miami next year, where are the 3 places on campus or in South Bend that you would least want to find yourself? All right, number 1 is easy. Gather around, kids. I'm going to tell you about Wreckers. Wreckers was a restaurant, kinda, located right behind South Dining Hall, and it was open 24/7, every day of the week. It's closed now, I'm pretty sure, so I am kind of showing my age here. That's why I said gather around, kids, because I'm not sure that any current Notre Dame students remember, but if you did go to Notre Dame and you're around my age or a little bit older, you know what I'm talking about. So back in the day, if you had stumbled into Wreckers at, say, like 1 or 2 a.m. after a Thursday night or any night on the weekend, it was mayhem. I'm talking about a swarm of 18 to 19-year-old kids who probably had a little bit too much to drink that night. They were hungry. They were feisty. And look, I actually enjoyed it when I was a freshman and sophomore because you run into a bunch of people, you get some food before you crash in your dorm. And I actually loved the barbecue chicken pizza, but then I actually went sober one time, got the same order that I would always get after a night out. I tried it and I'm like, oh, this is disgusting. Okay, so everyone's packed in. They're getting pizzas. they're getting all this kind of food, and the workers are pissed because they're dealing with so many drunk kids. And I actually felt so bad for the workers, man. They had to deal with way too much. And then you just got security guards trying to keep things in order. So if you were older and a little bit more mature and you were to step into that environment, it'd be like going into a zoo with like a bunch of tigers and some raw meat. It was absolutely chaos. It was fun at the time, but now looking back, you could not pay me to go and sit there for like 30 minutes at 1:30 a.m. on a packed night in Rutgers. So that would be number one. You never want to find yourself there. Number two, you don't want to find yourself in your professor's office about the week before finals wondering what score you need to get on the final to save your GPA. I've been there before. It was not a fun time. It's partially humiliating. It's also nerve-wracking because you realize you are going to be under pressure and you are going to have to really lock in and study your ass off for that final. So that is a place you don't want to be. As I said, unfortunately, I was in that situation before. Did pass, did save the day. Maybe I have the clutch gene. I'll talk to Skip Bayless and see what he has to say, but that was not a really fun place to be. And third, I would say you don't want to find yourself walking home alone from the bars in downtown South Bend when it's night out. Been there, done that, didn't end well. And we're going to end it there. All right, that's a wrap for this episode. That's another week of Locked On Irish in the books. Thanks again for making this your first listen of the day. No game this weekend, obviously, but I'm going to be back on Monday to do a big season preview for the Notre Dame men's basketball season, which tips off next Wednesday at home in Purcell Pavilion against Stonehill. Men's basketball beat writer Tom Noy is going to join. It's going to be a lot of fun, so make sure you tune in for that. Also, be sure to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you're listening to the podcast, and have a great weekend, everybody. I'll see you Monday.